afternoon and welcome to Scholars Hub at Home. My name is Julie Lafford. I'm the Executive Director for Alumni Engagement at York University. Thanks for joining us today for our lecture titled The Gathering Model of Community Engagement, a Research-Driven Approach to School Decision Making. This is, of course, part of our Scholars Hub webinar speaker series, which features relevant educational lectures by academics and researchers from York. Before we begin today, I want to acknowledge the land York's campuses are built on. As this event is virtual and we're not all gathered in the same space, I recognize that the following land acknowledgement might not be for the territory you're currently on. And if that's the case, please take the responsibility to acknowledge the traditional territory you're on and the current treaty holders. As a member of the York University community, I recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located, which precede the establishment of the university. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Takaronto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. I am grateful for the opportunity to live and work on Treaty 13 land. Before I introduce our speakers today, I did want to let you know about our first ever Top 30 Changemakers Under 30 list, which was released last week. These are 30 remarkable young alumni who are making a difference in their communities, the country, and around the world. They bring a uniquely global perspective to help solve societal challenges. They represent every faculty at the university and their leaders working and volunteering in a variety of fields, from health and sustainability to the arts and business. If you'd like to learn more, you can visit yorku.ca/alumni and friends/top30, and that link is in the chat now. I also want to invite you to join the upcoming York U of the Future alumni event on April 30th, where President Rhonda Linton will be joined by student, faculty, and alumni panelists to discuss the opportunities, challenges, and priorities for the university in 2021 and beyond, and to answer questions from alumni like you. So for more information, the link will also be in the chat, yorku.ca/alumni and friends/future. So let's get started. As always, we like to get to know our audience a bit better with a poll before we begin. So today's question is, how would you rate your current knowledge of today's topic? And that poll should pop up on your screen right now. So we'll give everyone a moment to respond. Thanks for participating, everyone. It's very helpful for us to have an idea of who's in the audience and knowledge you each have about the topic for today's discussion. If at any time you need help with a Zoom webinar, you can use that Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to enter your question, and our team is ready to help you. And I see the poll results are ready now too, and 67% of you say that you are somewhat informed. Only one says very high. So like you, I have a lot to learn from today's discussion, and I'm looking forward to it. So let me get back to that Q&A button. You can use that Q&A button to ask for help throughout the webinar, but also to ask questions of our panelists at the end of the webinar. So go ahead and ask away. For those of you watching on Facebook, feel free to submit any questions or comments through the comment section there, and the team will send them my way. So as I mentioned, today's title is The Gathering Model of Community Engagement, a research-driven approach to school decision-making, featuring Dr. John Ippolito, who is an associate professor in our Faculty of Education. Dr. Ippolito's research in teacher education includes a focus on educational practices in contexts of linguistic and cultural hyperdiversity, with a specific interest in barriers to home and school relations. He has served as the Faculty of Education lead on the Gathering Project since its inception in 2005. Joining him is Sarah Long, Equity Teacher Facilitator, Inclusive School and Community Services in the York Region District School Board. Sarah is a second-generation cisgender Chinese woman from Toronto. She's an experienced educator, currently working as an equity consultant for the York Region District School Board. She has a master's degree in leadership, policy, and change in equity and inclusive education from the University of Toronto. We also welcome Scott Milne, who is the manager of school and community projects as a field researcher with the York Region District School Board. His work on the political economy of Black education in apartheid South Africa informs his perspectives on the role public education plays in Canadian society. He has been with the YRDSB on the Gathering Project since 2005. So to our speakers, please go ahead and share your screens now, and I will be back after your presentation for the Q&A.
All right, Julie, I'll take that as my cue and I'll get started. Thank you, everyone.
Can you turn your camera on, John? I don't think you're on.
I thought, hang on a second. Let's see what I can do here.
There we go.
Are we good?
Your camera's on, but I can't see you for some reason. But you know what? I think you should carry on with your presentation.
I will. Yes.
Oh, there you go. Perfect. Thank you.
Voila.
I'll see you later.
Well, thank you, everyone, for taking the time to let us share with you a research project that's very near and dear to our hearts and has been for many years. The model of school and community relationships that we're going to share with you today, an initiative that we now call the Gathering Model, formerly known as the Gathering Under One Tree, is based on an ongoing 15-year collaboration between the York Region District School Board, YRDSB, and the Faculty of Education at York University. In 2005, they partnered formally to pilot a new model of community engagement. My colleague Scott Milne, who you will hear from in a moment, manager of school and community projects at YRDSB, and myself as an associate professor in the Faculty of Education with some experience in community-based projects of this sort, were invited to serve as project leads. Armidale Public School, that you see here in the photo, located in the Steeles and McCowan area, just inside the boundaries of York Region, was selected as the pilot site because it was the largest and most linguistically diverse school in the YRDSB and was in a neighborhood experiencing pronounced demographic shifts. The thinking was that the initiative could both capitalize on emerging assets within the changing population and respond to new challenges. Since this time, many years ago, multiple versions of the model have been implemented in over a dozen YRDSB schools. This is a model that goes beyond community engagement to explore the potential for family voices, including the voices of linguistically, culturally, and racially marginalized parents to support school and community improvement. And what you're looking at here is a poster from one of our gatherings events that my colleagues will talk more about in a few moments. This one, as you can see, is in English and in Tamil, Tamil being the predominant minority language of the Armidale community. The model responds both to recent patterns of migration and to extensive research on the positive impacts of parents taking an active role in their children's education. And included here are indicators such as strong academic achievement, more consistent attendance at school, higher rates of graduation, a strengthened sense of self-worth, and a more positive outlook on education. Interestingly, these positive indicators are reiterated in the literature for primary levels, secondary levels, and yes, even post-secondary levels. Now, one caveat worth noting here, an important one, and also documented in the literature, is the fact that these positive indicators linked to active parents, especially those indicators related to academic achievement, are more pronounced with parents from privileged groups. In other words, in the case of some poorer and minority parents, these potential benefits are often mitigated. At least for this reason, the Gathering model makes a deliberate attempt to draw in families who have historically been left outside discussions of school governance and school change. The Gathering model supports a cycle of community dialogue. This dialogue centers on after-school evening events involving, as you can see here, parents, administrators, teachers, students, researchers, and community service agencies. And my colleagues will have more to say about this in a moment. In most of our sites, the role of community agencies has been limited, but in some schools, their role has been more significant, even if only to highlight the services they offer. These events, these gathering events, anywhere from 1 to 4 per year at participating schools, address issues that parents think are important to their family's experience of public schooling. At some schools, the event now includes a separate student dialogue. Now, clearly, as we all know, the pandemic has put these in-person events on hold. As my school-based colleagues are keen to remind me, as with education more generally, our participating schools have experienced, well, what we could say is a fracturing of community, leaving students and families feeling disconnected from their schools. However, we are putting this forced time out to good use in revisiting initiatives the model has piloted over the years. Initiatives such as parent-driven research, parent and teacher study groups, and online discussion forums. We look forward to exploring links between these online platforms and in-person events, which will at some future point become possible. This interplay of in-person and online resources will remain defined by the cycle of community dialogue appearing in this flowchart, and which my colleague Sarah Leung will now elaborate. Sarah, over to you.
Thanks so much, John. So, as John mentioned, the gathering model is very different from existing and traditional approaches of parent and community involvement. We use the term parent involvement to describe school and community relationships, where schools ultimately hold the power. In parent involvement models, parents are typically encouraged to participate in their children's schools, but the agenda and the decisions still lie in the hands of the school still. And so in parent involvement models, the role of parents are determined by the schools, and parents do what the school is asked. The gathering model, however, is not one of involvement, but of parent and community engagement. And we use that term engagement to describe a relationship between school and community where they work alongside each other and where both groups hold power to make decisions and change impacting school improvement. And so most importantly in this model, community voice, community knowledges and experiences informs the decision-making process, and parent and community agency is a defining and driving factor. One component of the gathering model to actualize this are the community-developed agendas, which ensure that schools evolve in relation and in response to family needs, and where the community shares responsibility and power in determining agendas. And so in developing an agenda and topics for the discussion forums, at least half of each event's agenda is determined by students, families, and community partners who are a part of a planning team. The questions are then used to collect data for the school so that the system improvement is generated and acted on with community input. And in doing so, the gathering model seeks to change how schools connect with the families and the communities they serve and the very nature of that school and community relationship. And so on the screen here in the left box, you'll see some of the sample questions that have been used at gatherings with schools in the past. And on the right-hand side, you'll see a capture of some of the ways that families have responded to some of these responses. And so this shift to a community-centered agenda and to community-centered dialogue to inform school planning processes is made with a really important understanding that families from communities which have been historically marginalized continue to face systemic barriers in education, including barriers to parent and community engagement. And so conscious attention to what those barriers are, to whose voices are present and absent in school and system planning, and the use of anti-oppressive practices that actively seek to disrupt these are foundational in every aspect of the gathering model. And these reasons underscore why a formalized planning team consisting of staff, of families, and community partners is a fundamental component of the gathering model. While everyone is invited to the planning team, a deliberate effort is made to engage individuals, community members, and organizations that represent marginalized communities and voices. So things like rotating membership for community members and flexibility in the timing of meetings helps to encourage this engagement and ensures accessibility of opportunity. This planning team is involved in every stage of the cycle, from the pre-planning event to event design, to post-event data analysis, to data mobilization in school and system planning. And throughout this process, the model becomes a regular and an ongoing formalized community engagement structure and process in schools. And so once these planning steps are in place, the school is then ready to invite all the stakeholders to the conversation through a community dialogue event. Community dialogue events will begin with a shared meal, which usually comes from local vendors with considerations of cultural and dietary needs. And the purpose of the event is to bring students, families, and staff together. Schools have held this event in school gyms and libraries, and some schools have organized these events in local community spaces, such as a neighborhood mosque, which is what you're seeing here in the image. Planning the physical space also requires consideration of religious accommodations, including prayer spaces and gender-inclusive bathrooms. The purpose of the shared meal is really to provide time and space for people to get to know each other through conversation. And so this is why during this portion of the evening, tables are set up and all stakeholders are invited to sit with each other, regardless of their roles. And what this does is it encourages community building by removing the barriers of formal titles like administrator, school staff member, community organization leader, parent, or student. And in addition, some schools have encouraged student performances in order to open and closed shared meals, and to bring families together in celebration of students. And at the end of the meal, children are directed to various child-minding spaces and activities, while the adults remain in that shared space in order to engage in table-based discussions based on the agenda items. And so both the shared meal and child-minding or any other expenses are funded through the school. And again, this is to remove any barriers for families who are wanting to take part in this community dialogue process. And community dialogue events engage stakeholders in open-ended conversations while removing those potential barriers for participation. And so one such barrier for many families is language. Intentional steps are made to lessen this by providing translation technology and also on-site translators to reflect the home languages of the families. And in addition, designated tables are assigned for conversations in preferred languages with additional support of translators as needed. And you can see in these two images here, the discussions that are happening amongst Cantonese and Tamil families. And amongst the groups are teacher liaisons who facilitate the conversations. And another barrier is posed by power differentials between various stakeholders within education. And these differences can influence what gets shared and what is kept silent. So in order to disrupt this, the event is set up to encourage the discussion of agenda items between stakeholders in the same role, rather than across stakeholder groups. And this provides an opportunity to speak openly about their thoughts and their experiences. The table-based discussions that occur between the stakeholders is the highlight of the event. And so it takes up about 3/4 of the time. These discussions are essential in gathering community understanding, perspectives, and approaches, which really becomes valuable data to inform school planning. And so with that, I'll just pass it over to Scott to talk about community voice as data.
Thank you, Sarah. Just want to let everybody know that as my kids are hopefully in their virtual classrooms right now, I won't be using my camera until the Q&A. Count yourselves lucky for that. I'm going to be talking a little bit about the political context in which the gathering model has been rolled out and continues to be rolled out. First of all, I think it's important to note that the gathering model is explicitly aimed at helping schools move from a community involvement framework, whereby schools inform the community of their decisions and processes and explain the rationale behind them, to a community engagement framework, whereby schools do all of that work, but are also open to changing the processes by which key decisions are made. In fact, the gathering model, and we'll use the term model and project interchangeably because the model is a concept and the project is really the effort to roll out that concept throughout the system. So the gathering project is part of a larger concept known within the York board as inclusive design. Inclusive design is based on the assumption that both school and system planning processes stand a better chance of meeting the complex needs of students when more diverse perspectives and skill sets are part of that equation. Those perspectives and skill sets, we believe, are supplied by various parts of the community. What do I mean by education as contestation? Well, as you heard some of my background in terms of political economy and education in South Africa, I've learned a lot about how education is situated in Canada from that work that I've done. And there are a lot of similarities, believe me. The move from involvement to engagement in the promotion of inclusive design are not occurring in a social or political vacuum. Change in any large institution, and the York Region District School Board is one of the largest school boards in Canada, never happens without tension, even conflict. As we all know, education is one of the most important reproducers of society's dominant relationships, many of which perpetuate long-standing inequities. Sarah's alluded to that. As we also know that no institution is a monolith, and in schools and school boards, there is always tension between those who think the role of schools is primarily to help maintain a stable society based on the status quo, and those who believe schools should be an engine for societal change. Clearly, efforts to make schools more inclusive, equitable, and accountable, like the Gathering Project, are gaining support both from within and outside of the education system, but they also have their opponents. It is in this light of political contestation that we can see the gathering model as having the potential to be conflict resolving in the long term, which is hopeful, but also the reality is it's conflict creating in the short and medium term. For John and I, it didn't take long for us to get a sense of this dynamic. At the meeting when York University first introduced the gathering concept to the board, we witnessed a spirited debate between two high-ranking leaders about the relevance of such a project in the York region context. Over the years, we've learned that if we're not constantly aware for the potential for tensions to emerge in this work, and if we do not have strategies for moving through these difficult situations, we'll be setting the project up for failure. We have to understand what institutional change and cultural shifts are all about. Having evaluated many pilot projects in our system over the past 20 years, it is clear that we must have an understanding of the dynamics of institutional change in both schools and the school boards in which they operate before embarking on best laid plans. Even as the gathering model has gained support and spread to more schools, discomfort and opposition continue to be parts of the rollout reality. As you know very well, schools regularly collect quantitative, statistical, and qualitative narrative-based data from students, parents, and community members. What you may not know is that relatively few schools have processes in place whereby the community sees the results of that data mining and what was done with the data. As you've seen, the gathering model cycle includes a report back loop that keeps the community informed on what, if anything, was done with the information collected at gathering events. This also includes schools acknowledging when they hit barriers in mobilizing that data. That's a completely understandable part of the change process. Not all the data gathered can be mobilized quickly or effectively. However, communities deserve to know when barriers are impacting data mobilization and deserve the chance to suggest strategies for overcoming those barriers. Schools and educators do not have all the answers, and communities are not devoid of skills and ideas, and I would add passions and aspirations to that. This kind of external accountability is something most public schools and school boards do not practice with regularity. Sadly, all too often, communities are asked to work with the system in times of crisis. And I would say this, you can go to municipal governments, children's aid societies, police. It's similar in large institutions. They invite communities in times of crisis. Unfortunately, we know that times of crisis are when the trust between communities and large systems like school boards is low. My last point relates to the overdependence of schools and school boards on statistical data, and the lack of literacy around collection and mobilization of qualitative data. As in other large institutions, and I've just named a few of them, school and school board planning processes are almost completely dependent on statistics. There's very little understanding how qualitative data could be used in formal planning at any level. So by that I mean in schools, in system departments, or at the very highest level of planning in a school board. While the system hosts many student and parent focus groups and town halls every year, there are two important barriers to these events, I put that in parentheses, having sustained impact. First, there's a culture which sees such events as check-ins and a way of projecting an image of openness and accountability. There is generally an overall lack of intentionality to sporadic one-offs that do not connect with one another, nor do they feed into formal planning processes. Secondly, where there is an increasing amount of commitment to do this kind of work, there is usually a lack of training and resources to construct approaches both impactful and sustainable. So a lot of people on the front lines are doing really good work engaging with communities. How are they plugged into the system? Whether that system and institution is the school or system department or the board in general. The result is that statistics continue to be the go-to form of data used in planning, and community trust of school and school boards outreach tends to be low. There are signs that recent debates around racism and other forms of social inequity may be generating more openness to not only hearing from, but responding to marginalized parts of school communities. But again, we need strategies for moving the gathering model forward, given that there remains significant discomfort with hearing voices of the other and allowing these voices to have a place at the planning table. One of those strategies is that members of the board's inclusive school and community services department, of which Sarah and I are members, work closely with schools to show how the data streams flowing into the school from gathering events and meetings can be just as powerful in planning processes as statistics. But the model also encourages schools to have data mobilization strategies in place before collecting any data from some stakeholders, in order to ensure that the time, energy, and risks students, parents, and community members invest in the process are valued, respected, and utilized to the fullest. Now back to Dr. John.
I know we're running close on time here, so I'll conclude very briefly. We thought we would close by sharing remarks from one of the parents who's taken a lead role in supporting the program. And while I won't be overly optimistic here, and I won't suggest that all the parents participating in the program feel the same way as this parent, over the years, we have received extremely positive feedback and support from parents and families. So much so that at some schools, the gathering has become more than simply an ongoing event, but rather a long-standing cultural practice, a way of enacting community that incoming teachers, and especially administrators, since administrators are typically rotated across schools every few years, a way of enacting community that they cannot ignore and are expected to support. A parent writes, "The gathering model has made an impact on our community in ways beyond what I can explain in words. It has given a voice to marginalized parents and caregivers and helped bridge a communication gap between school and home. It eliminated the language barriers for many parents and caregivers and allowed them to express their concerns freely. It has helped build relationships, not just between school and the community, but also among parents and caregivers. The gathering has made it possible to transform ideas and suggestions into implementable solutions because the end result is a collective perspective of students, staff, and the community." And that's from Hirosh Abe Wardene, one of our parents. And I'm going to end it there for all of us collectively.
Thank you all so much for that really interesting talk. Sarah and Scott, you can turn your cameras on now. Scott, obviously optional if you're not able to. I really liked how clearly you all articulated the limitations of typical school board practices. And I can tell that you're all really great educators. I was sitting here thinking, wow, they've done a bang up job of like making this really accessible. And then I realized there's a reason for that. So thank you for sharing that with us. So we now have time for our audience to ask questions for our presenters today. You can use that Q&A function, as I said, at the bottom of the screen to ask questions, and my colleagues will feed them to me. So I'd like to start with something that, John, you talked a little bit about at the top. And I'm interested in how the restrictions made necessary by COVID-19 have affected the project and what kind of mitigation practices you've put in place.
Well, yeah, as I mentioned, I mean, the fact that, I mean, the backbone of the project has been and continues to be these face-to-face gatherings. I mean, I don't think there really is. I mean, I think we're all learning this collectively that there's, I mean, we can introduce substitutes into face-to-face physical contact, but there really isn't a replacement. The backbone of those projects is the fact that it is both a pedagogical and curricular event, but also a social one. I mean, and the whole bit about, you know, eating together. I mean, this is a documented research fact that people who eat together interact with each other differently. The trust levels are generally higher. There's a more meaningful interaction. So the question around, you know, how have we compensated? I don't think, strictly speaking, we've been able to compensate in a way that would sustain the original project in its kind of physical reality in the way that we would have wanted to. I mean, as I mentioned in my remarks, I mean, we're taking, I mean, there's a lot of planning going on behind the scenes for moving the project forward. There was actually planning going on before the pandemic. The planning is continuing now with a view to what this project is going to look like once we emerge from the dust of the pandemic. It's really difficult to sustain a project like this in an entirely online format. We're exploring possibilities, and as I mentioned, we're looking back at some of the initiatives that we experimented with over the years. So we had experimented with parent-driven research, which was again primarily face-to-face and physical. We had experimented with parent and teacher groups, which again was primarily physical and face-to-face. We had also experimented to some degree with online platforms. And I must say that proved to be a mix, you know, we met with mixed success. So again, you know, this is a learning curve for all of us. It's a learning curve that since the beginning, and it continues to be a learning curve. And the challenges thrown up by the pandemic are part of that learning curve. So I'm not gonna, you know, propose, you know, this notion that somehow we've been able to insert an online replacement to the gathering. We haven't been able to do that, and I don't think we've expected ourselves to be able to do that. But we're watching very carefully at what we're learning by having to do things entirely online, and how we might draw on those when it becomes possible to return to something that looks a little more normal.
Thank you. Scott or Sarah, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I just wanted to let people know that we are in discussions with Thought Exchange, which is a Vancouver-based I mean, they do run live town halls as well, but their thing, Thought Exchange, really is about the virtual world and collecting data through virtual town halls. So this last week we had a presentation from Thought Exchange with our department. Our board actually has 5 licenses to run Thought Exchange virtual town halls, but it's housed in the research department. And here you go with another sort of insight into large institutions, if you need any more, is we are trying to work better internally. I mean, large institutions are built on silos, unfortunately. So we've actually, our department, Inclusive School and Community Services, is in negotiations with Thought Exchange ourselves to get our own departmental license to use that, because how a research department would run town halls and the reasons for doing that would be very different than the reasons why for our department running the same under the guise of the gathering model.
Thank you. I have a great question from Janice Franklin in the audience. asking, in using qualitative data, how do you know if the data collected is a common concern in the community or just the concern of one person at the table? And does it matter? Scott, do you want to start with that, since you covered that all?
Yeah, so again, as you know, the model is that there will be discussions occurring on the same question at multiple tables. It'd be the same running student town halls. How do you look at that? So first of all, you look at the data pool that comes in. You're getting huge amounts of data from these events, because at each table you have a facilitator taking notes virtually on a device of some kind. And so all that data is accumulated. It's analyzed the same way any other qualitative data set would be analyzed. However, I want to suggest to you that the other end of the spectrum is also important. So you may have consensus over certain issues or topics, but you may have a very strong minority opinion that's very different. Those strong minority opinions have to be included in the summary, in the analysis, because it is possible, as we all know as researchers, that you generate in these kinds of settings groupthink. One person can impact and our facilitators are trained on how you deal with that. But there are very strong outsider opinions that need to be recorded and need to be reported. And we certainly report that they're in the context of being a minority opinion, but some of them have tremendous insight, and somebody might have way better understanding of how a school operates, or how a school board operates, or how the Ministry of Education is mandating things that schools have to do that a lot of members of the community may not be aware of. So it's a balancing act of the bulk of the data versus some really important outsider perspectives or out of the box perspectives.
Thanks, Scott. John or Sarah, did you want to add anything?
I think Sarah should weigh in here, because I know that she's done some very creative data interpretation at one of her participating schools.
Yeah, I thanks, John. I think and Scott for starting that off. I think I wanted to build on a little bit of what Scott was saying. I think as we are paying attention to what is being shared through the conversations and the data, I think it's important to kind of understand that broader vision that we spoke to, or that understanding around, how different communities experience different barriers within education. And particular communities which have been more impacted, right, or have been greatly impacted through some of the historical, legacies that we know have occurred through the marginalization of communities through education. And so as we're paying attention to what is being shared, sometimes it's not necessarily about how often a comment is being shared, but also needing to understand and to think about the identities and the perspectives that represents. And so, for example, if there is a particular a larger number of a particular identity within a demographics, you will of course perhaps hear more of a particular perspective, right? And so that doesn't mean that we're not paying attention to perhaps that one family or one parent who is coming from an identity and doesn't share that identity with other folks within the school community, in that consideration. So this is where it's really important to have that understanding that it's not just about the frequency, it's about paying attention to and understanding the ways that different communities have experienced marginalization or privilege within our society and our education systems, and understanding how, even if it may come from one voice, that the pattern that is being surfaced may actually be surfacing patterns that actually have been demonstrated and documented through research that reflects a community's experience, right? And so those are some things to put into consideration when we're looking at, what is being shared and how we sort of consider all these different perspectives. In particular, if we're considering the gathering as a way to disrupt those barriers, to identify and to think of how the school can move forward to serve all of the communities and the families in their school community and in a better way.
Julie, can I jump in very quickly?
You do, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I would remiss if I didn't add this observation. I mean, as an academic who's been involved in the project now for, I'm counting the years, Scott, and they're going by very quickly, for 16 or 17 years. I mean, one of the it's as if the discussion at the moment is the tip of a very large iceberg. And part of what makes up that large iceberg is the fact that the research culture at the board and school level is not quite the same as the research culture one finds in a university. They clearly have overlaps in areas of commonality, but they're not always the same creature. And I think part of the challenge for all of us in managing that relationship between the university and the board in a research context has been to think about what are our priorities for the research and how do we sustain those priorities. Now, clearly, my colleagues have made it clear to me again and again that the priority here is to mobilize the data in such a way that it leads to meaningful change at the school and board level. And this is and the other part of that equation is, for me as a university-based researcher, is how do you develop, nurture, and sustain that research capacity? For example, Sarah has spoken and Scott has spoken to the vast quantity of qualitative data that can be generated by these events. How do we work with that data in such a way that as an academic, it has to be a legitimate methodical process for working through the data, but in such a way that we can be nimble enough to pull out meaningful insights from the data and orient them towards school change.
Interesting points. Thank you all for that. So we have time for one, maybe two more questions. You mentioned, I can't remember which of you, I'm sorry, mentioned language as sort of a barrier or challenge for parents who are marginalized. What other challenges do parents who are marginalized face in supporting their children's education? Who'd like to begin? John?
Well, I can jump in. I mean, as my colleagues can attest to this, I mean, the barriers can emerge along language lines. They can emerge along cultural lines. They can emerge along, racial lines. I mean, for me, the overarching thematic here, having grown up in a linguistic and cultural minority family myself and navigated those two worlds of home and mainstream Canadian schooling, in many cases, parents simply aren't familiar with the cultural practices that allow them to leverage the school in ways that benefit their kids. And part of what our project here tries to do is to introduce parents to those cultural practices and to let them know that, yes, it is appropriate for you to be contacting your children's school, to be contacting your children's teachers. Indeed, it's entirely appropriate for you to attend our gathering events and to share your perspective on your kids' education with the teachers and administrators and researchers who have historically been responsible for school governance. It is entirely you belong here. That's the message that our gathering tries to tell parents. You belong here in this place, at this table, in this discussion around school governance and school change.
Thanks. Scott, would you like to add something?
Yeah, I think unfortunately the reality is that particularly if we're looking at the gathering, what's intended to do in terms of engaging or re-engaging marginalized parents and families and community members, I think one of the factors that's absolutely a barrier is fear. Now, that to some degree gets addressed, chipped away at that fear when the table-based discussions occur in multiple languages. We have translators and transcribers. There's a reason for that. And we let people sit with their affinity group, with whether that's family, friends, neighborhood people, whatever it is, because there is frankly a distrust of schools and school boards. If I say exactly what's happening to my kid and how angry I am, is that going to make the situation for my child or my children worse? Am I going to have to go to war just to have a voice? Am I going to have to go to war with other parents in this meeting tonight? So fear is definitely a factor. And we certainly do take that into consideration when we plan all our activities.
Thanks, that's a great point. Sarah, did you want to add on?
Yeah, and if I can build on what John and Scott are saying, I think the barriers that we alluded to, that it's really important in part of the planning processes around the language, and as Scott was talking about, having the different tables for, thinking about the power and the different roles that we hold. I think that is really about removing the barriers so that families are able to engage in the conversations, to communicate and to express what they're experiencing. I think an additional barrier and a challenge that we also run into is really around some of the structures within the school. So for example, how this data gets taken up. And as we had mentioned, that is an integral part of the process, is the agency of the community being encouraged and supported and included, right, throughout all those parts of the process, beyond just the evening of sitting around the table and being able to share, the perspectives around those particular questions, but being able to be present when that data is being sorted, when that data is being interpreted, and then also when that data is then being used to move forward into school decision-making processes, right? And so, I think one of those barriers is the move to beyond the one evening, and to ensure that the community is a part of all those processes. And I think in addition to that, as the dialogues are happening, I think, again, being conscious of the relationships, right? Not only between community and schools, but communities with each other, right? And so just thinking about, when you have someone from the community who perhaps holds an identity that's been marginalized, sharing a particular perspective of an experience, what are some of those things that need to be in place in order to ensure that not only the school, but also other community members are also, receiving that and being able to kind of think and reflect in a supportive way around the experiences that are happening. Because we know that for many of the families and students from marginalized communities, that sometimes the sharing of a particular experience can then get dismissed as an opinion, or as this is just one experience, right? And so there are some of those other pieces that I think we as a society, and even in the system, are trying to really think about assumptions, biases, and barriers. And I think those sometimes will come into the conversations as well. And so that's why the planning process and having that formalized team with the considerations of whose voices are present on the team and how that supports that planning process, and in identifying the barriers and in being able to put in place practices that will disrupt those barriers, are an essential part of the gathering and needs to be included throughout all the four components as was shared in that diagram of the cycle.
Thank you all for your responses. Unfortunately, we're just over time, and I know there's questions waiting in queue. I apologize. We never do get to all of them. But thank you, John, Sarah, and Scott, for your time today, for sharing your work with all of us. And I wish we had a little more time with you to get to some of these questions, but thank you so much. You can turn your video off now, and we'll be in touch. Before we say goodbye to our audience, I want to thank you as well for joining us today. And we have one last poll question for you. And that question is, how would you rate your knowledge of today's topic following this discussion? So that should pop up on your screen now. Please take a moment to respond. As you know, if you've been to Scholars Hub before, we have so many great lectures in store for you coming up. So be sure to check out the website for details. The next one is on Wednesday, April 21st. It's called How Ecological Footprints Accounting Can Inform Pathways to a Carbon Neutral Economy. It will be a special Earth Day edition of Scholars Hub in partnership with our Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change. Our website is yorku.ca/alumni and friends. All of our events are listed there. And as usual, this talk will be posted to our YouTube account, so you can share that with all of your friends and family, others who might be interested. And that is all for now. I look forward to seeing you all again soon. Until then, stay safe.